Hey guys, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. Today is going to be my full review and discussion of the Zero Tolerance 0308. And I've got to say right off the hop that this knife appealed to me pretty well the minute I saw it. And it definitely, as I look at this knife, I can see a bit of a throwback to the 0200, which was a knife I really enjoyed, the 0300, which was a knife I really enjoyed, and even to a degree, the Hinderer flare, I think, is there in this from the 0560, which again was a knife I really enjoyed. And I've been waiting for ZT. To me, those were quintessential ZTs. And when they kind of moved away from that, it was pretty disappointing to me as a fan. I get businesses have to pivot and they've got to respond to the market and all that stuff. And so they made a bunch of knives that were essentially just high-end titanium frame locks, right? They weren't hard use, they weren't heavy duty, they weren't in any way, associated with the typical marketing of ZT. But this is kind of a throwback to what they were originally doing. And maybe it's all nostalgia, but I have to say, I for one really, really like that. Although I get that not everyone will. If you were a fan of the 0450 or the 0808, you probably won't like this. Okay, but I would suggest to you that the 0450 and the 0808 were not. They're just high-end titanium frame locks, right? They're not really ZTs, other than they have that label on them, but they don't have the ZT aesthetic. They don't have like the built like a tank stuff does not belong on the box of an 808. All right. So I know that might be a little controversial to some, and I know I may be picking on some of your favorite models, and that's fine. I'm not really trying to make anybody happy with my views. I'm just telling you what I'm thinking as I look at this knife. And so this knife to me is what a real ZT is supposed to be about. And if you're new to the market, and if you're new to knives, maybe you didn't ever know ZT when it first came out and was really pushing that element of their design. And so for you, maybe this is like, what? This is a ZT? What's going on here? And I get that as well. So having gotten all of that out by way of introduction, let's work our way through here and see if I can sustain my argument that this is a bit of a throwback, a little more in keeping with what ZT is about, and in fact, maybe a bit of an improvement on some of those knives that I mentioned, like the 200, the 300, the 0560. That were sort of some of the initial ZTs that people got really, really stoked about. First off, let me say that this is a very substantial folder. Okay, this is big, it's heavy, it's hand filling. It's designed to be that way, at the very least, to have a hard use aesthetic. Whether or not we can actually call it hard use is a subject I discussed in a different video, and it'll come up a little bit here as we do some comparisons. I'm going to save that part of the discussion, and I've got a lot of comparisons here because one of the things that I think has changed since Zero Tolerance came out with their particular philosophy is that now there are tons and tons of options in terms of hard use folders as well as in terms of high-end titanium frame locks. So they're not, it's going to be a little more difficult for them to make an impact in the marketplace because there's so many other options, and we'll talk about that as well. So stick around for that, and I'd love to hear your comments below in terms of, hey, this knife is close, but what about this, that, or the other? So I'd love you to share models down there that you think kind of overshadow this one, and I think there are some out there. So let's get into size and weight. 8 and 15/16 overall, so almost 9 inches in length, 3 3/4 inches on the blade, 5 3/16 on the handle, so a bit over 5 inches there. 4 inches of grip area. Okay, so pretty substantial. You can see I've got quite a bit of space left over, even in a hammer grip. So my hands could actually be like almost a ½ inch larger in breadth. Okay, the distance across here, and I'd still have room on this handle. So very big, very hand-filling knife. Very, well, fairly hefty. If you take a look, let's see if I can show you inside here, you can see that they have skeletonized the steel side, haven't done much with the tie side, and so this weighs in at 7 ounces, which is, to me, not a big deal. I know for some of you, you'll be like, what in the world, 7 ounces? And if all you've ever carried is like a pair of 2, that's not going to make sense, but I regularly carry big, heavy, substantial knives, so 7 ounces is not a huge thing for me, although I know that'll immediately put some of you off completely. So in terms of carry, I find this carries quite well, especially because of the contoured handle. I've said this before, but big knives, if you're going to make a big knife, it's going to be a little more unruly in pocket. But by contouring the handle, by rounding things off, it does, at least to me, make a difference when you put this in your pocket. So I think that's one nice touch that they've done here, not only from an ergonomic standpoint, but from a feel in pocket standpoint. Let's touch on the blade, because I have to say, this is probably my favorite zero tolerance blade. Now, I don't love the stone wash. I actually would like to see, a satin finish or satin and stone wash, or some variation of that. That ZT is actually that they do quite a lot. In this case, they opted not to do that. They went with a full stone wash, and it looks okay, but I prefer a satin finish. Now that's totally subjective, okay? What isn't subjective is that this blade will cut. And come on, focus you. Still not doing it. Sorry, guys. Come on. There we go. So now you can get a nice close look. And the nice thing about this blade is, one, it's not crazy thick blade stock. Okay. It's thick enough that it feels like a ZT. It's not, it's not slim and reminding me of a kitchen knife or anything. But that high flat grind means that it doesn't have a huge edge. So the edge geometry is pretty nice. It's not that thick behind the edge. And then a very flat grind means that this actually slices really, really well. It actually puts me in mind of the framelocks, which is a knife that I've commented on before as cutting way better than you think it should based on the kind of knife it is. And that's the same thing can be said of this knife. It cuts really, really well, and 20 CV is great steel. So the performance on this blade is fantastic. Probably one of the nicest cutting ZTs in existence. There are a few others that have been fairly flat and reasonably thin that are okay, but in my mind, none of the ZTs that I've reviewed stand out as cutting as well as this one. So I think this blade is a huge win, even though I'm not totally in love with the stonewash finish. Let's move over to the action here. So we've got pretty typical titanium frame lock bar insert here, bearing pivot. This is the Kershaw, KVT. Excuse me, guys. KVT pivot that we're pretty used to seeing. The lock bar is quite accessible. The flipper tab is grippy and comfortable, so that if you're the kind of guy who's sitting on the couch, watching whatever you're watching these days. I know there's no sports on, but maybe you're watching, The Office for the 10th time, flipping your knife on the couch. This is definitely a knife that can do that very comfortably, and everything on it is just accessible and comfortable. The detent is really nice. You can see the blade does drop shut there quite nicely. And you can adjust that pivot over here on this side. You can see that it fits a wrench. I don't know why I'm having trouble with the focus today, but there it is. There, now you can see it just fine. I got to hold the knife further away. The camera's just not self-adjusting for some reason. Anyway, I'm pretty happy with the action. The lock bar is accessible, as I was saying. Everything is comfortable. It's snappy. It's smooth. It's all the things that I expect to see in a high-end titanium frame lock. The one thing that I will say about a bearing pivot is I do think it makes the knife less hard use. Now, I'm not the guy who's rolling around in the dirt and, throwing my knife in the sandbox and burying it and then pulling it out to see how the action is, because in my regular use of a knife, I don't normally bury it in sand. Okay, so well, I would, and by the way, if you buried a knife with phosphor bronze washers in sand, you're still going to get grit in the pivot. Okay, having said that, I still prefer in what's supposed to be a hard use knife to have a non-bearing pivot, whether it be, the Teflon of a Hinderer, whether it be the phosphor bronze, which of course I prefer, and especially my favorite option is going to be the oversized pivot that you're going to get in a Chris Reeve, whatever, Inkosi, or in this case an Inkosi, but also even in a 21 or an Untitled or whatever the case may be. I love those oversized pivots. And that's what I'd like to see in a hard use knife. Now, this does bring me to one point that's going to sort of transition, because this is partly handle construction and partly pivot design. So we've got this decorative pivot and then this cutout. All right. And what to say about the cutout? It doesn't, okay, in my experience, all right, and I'm trying to be very careful and precise with my language here. In my experience, it has not affected the performance in any way. However, you can see if I pivot that just a little bit, yeah, pun intended, you can see right into the pivot. In fact, if you wanted to lubricate this, I guess that'd be a benefit because you could almost touch those bearings by reaching through this opening. Now, my concern with that was that now, in addition to having, a bearing pivot, you now have direct access to that pivot for all the dirt and grime and pocket lint and every other kind of crap you've got in your pocket or out of your pocket when you got the knife out and using it. And I still sort of stand by that, although I will admit that over the few months that I've been using and carrying this knife, and as I said, I like the performance on this knife a lot, so I've actually used and carried it quite a bit. One time in all of that time, and it was actually shortly after I got the knife, I did loosen everything up, clean out the pivot, and lubricate it, and that's it. So over a few months use, it has not been a problem. I haven't had issues getting a bunch of junk caught in this pivot and it causing me problems. Does that mean it never could or that somebody else won't have that problem? No, it doesn't. It just means, from a review standpoint, it's hard for me to be overly critical for something that for me hasn't actually been a problem. Okay, so that's going to be my take on that hole. Do I like what it adds aesthetically? I don't think it adds a whole lot aesthetically, really. Maybe if you wanted to do something here, they could have done an inlay or they could have, I don't know. Frankly, I think it was fine if you just left this as plain titanium. So anyway, let's carry on with the rest of the handle. In terms of the rest of the handle, we've got 3D machined G10 with a stainless steel liner, 3D machined titanium on this side. We've got this black hardware, standoffs, spring clip, which on a $300 knife is maybe not my favorite thing to see, but it's definitely fine. In terms of this relief cut, I will complain about that a little. This is a super big and super thin relief cut, which if you recall when Cold Steel did their comparison video between the 0300 and whatever they compared it to, I can't remember, but the 0300 actually did fail right at that relief cut. Okay. And so to me, that demonstrates that the relief cut is a point of potential failure on a titanium frame lock. And the design of that cutout ought to be thought through carefully in a way to make it as strong as possible while still achieving the ability to move that lock bar. Okay. And so I would argue something like, the way Ferrum Forge does it, or in fact, the way it was done on my Riot Torrent, which I don't happen to have here with me, so I can't show it to you. But there, they left a thicker portion at the front to add stability the way you would do with like a steel I-beam, okay? And I think that's a really, really nice solution to that problem and definitely an improvement. This doesn't have it. And so, again, that, it makes me sort of, not want to put this in really that hard use category. It's still got the hard use aesthetic. It's still got the overbuilt feel in hand, but is it actually overbuilt? And I feel like, not any more overbuilt than most titanium frame locks out there. Okay. So in terms of handle construction, I think that covers most of my thoughts. There is a lanyard hole here. If you want to use that, you can move the clip to the other side. Some guys really complain whenever they see this. I don't really care. Like, I don't feel like those 3 holes really detract all that much. And in fact, if this was black, and I know a number of you have said you don't like the brown G10, so let's comment on that for a minute. I actually kind of like the Coyote Tan G10. I've had other knives in that, and in fact, back when the 0560 came out, it originally released in black, and then they did another edition in, roughly this color of G10 that was actually quite popular. So somehow, things have changed and people are not in love with that brand anymore. I still have no problem with it. In fact, I kind of like it. Is it the only color that I feel like could work? Well, no. In fact, if this was black or gray or any number of other colors, I feel like it would be just fine as long as you didn't make it, I don't know, orange or red or green or something like that. Okay, so that's my take on how this is put together and the color choices and the aesthetics. Now, I guess I should comment a little bit on the looks and say overall, I do kind of like the look of this knife. I don't love the cutout there, but I don't feel like it ruins the look or anything like that. Would I be happier if this was filled in? Probably a little happier, okay? But I feel like I can't take away a lot of points for that because I don't just despise it with all my being or something. All right, so let's move on now, having talked about construction and looks, to ergonomics, or ergos as some people like to call it. This knife is the rounding and the size of this handle makes it actually feel really good in hand. It feels great in a saber grip, feels great in a hammer grip. It's got good retention. You feel like you've got a pretty good, at least I feel like the grip on this is quite comfortable. A bit of jimping there on the little thumb rest, and so in terms of using this knife and making cuts with it and holding it in various different grips, I think this is pretty comfortable. Is it the most comfortable knife I've ever had? Well, no, but it's certainly completely appropriate and totally usable for, even if you really had to bear down and do some work. I don't find it to be that bad. Okay, so that's the handle. And that's about the last of the points that I want to discuss in terms of the knife specifically. I want to now transition into some comparisons. And this is going to be a pretty significant component of this video. I know we're 16 minutes in already. We're going to be a bit longer because I've got a lot of knives here to share with you. I want to start by comparing what I'm going to call hard use knives. Okay, so if you're looking at this because you want something heavy duty and hard use, I do think there are probably better options. Right now, the knife that I would easily recommend is the 8010. This is one of my favorite hard use knives. It's a little more expensive, not as expensive as this, but I felt like this compared a little better to the ZT than say the Recon 1, but the Recon 1 would be another good option. While we're thinking of this, what about the framelocks? Okay. If you're going to treat this as an occasional carry, now I will say this is going to be more carryable on an EDC basis than the framelocks, but the framelocks is certainly a knife that as an occasional carry I use and I love, and it really, really is about as hard use as a folding knife can get. Okay, and for I don't know, like $50 more for this version. All right. And if you go to the other version, by the way, yes, I now have all of the versions of the framelocks, and I will be making a video comparison in the next, I don't know, sometime in the next week or two, you'll see that video go up. So you can get a much cheaper version of this. Now, this is not going to have the edge retention, and this is definitely a more budget-friendly option. But if you're looking for a really hard use knife, that would be something to consider. And if you want something a little more carryable and similar in size, then I think the 8010 is very, very appropriate to think about. All right, now I've also got a couple of others. I've got a ZT here that is not mine, but it's visiting from a friend. This is the 0470. No, it's not. It's the 0640. This is the 0640. It's an Emerson design based on the Emerson Viper, hence the snakeskin looking scale. But the reason I bring this in is because it still cuts pretty well. It's not as nice in terms of blade geometry, but there's no bearing pivot in here. It's on washers, which I think is quite a nice option here, and probably then represents a pretty good option for an EDC hard use, hard carrying knife. Almost as much blade length. Just a really, really nice ZT. I've also got an XM18 here. Now this may be, maybe you go, well, this is going to cost way more, but not really. This being a Gen 4 or so, maybe it's a Gen 5, but it's before, it's just before the tri-way pivot. These can be had at a pretty reasonable price, especially in a very standard plain Jane configuration. And so I think that's one of the challenges that knives like this have to sort of think through, is the fact that, when you price your knife close to $300, that puts you into a category where you can really be coming up against some pretty high-end stuff. And I would think of both of these knives as, look, if you've already saved up $300, then is it going to take you that long or be that difficult to either save up, to buy these brand new, another $100 and something, or to buy them on the secondary market, another $50 or $25 will get you something like this. Okay, so I think those are significant considerations. And these days, the fact is that the kind of knife enthusiast who's going to be buying this, they're not just looking on Knife Center, right? They're looking on Blade forums. They're probably members of 15 different Facebook groups that all have, some capacity to buy and sell used stuff. And that means the market is very different. All right. So I think those are all viable options to consider, and certainly knives that you may want to look at. I guess the one thing I haven't done is I pretty well always throw a Para 2 in, just because people are so familiar with it. So let's just do that. I'm not suggesting these are comparable in any way, but I just know you guys are all pretty familiar with the size of the Para 2. Now, there's another category that I want to bring in here. So far, I've showed you knives that I would classify as fairly hard use knives, but there's also the category of sort of high-end titanium frame lock, which this is kind of in as well. So let's throw in a couple of those. Here is the Brs Thresher. Beautiful, beautiful knife. Certainly different. Okay, the styling here is different than this, but it is a really nicely done titanium frame lock in high-end materials with a great action and a bearing pivot, and so that may be something to look at. Of course, when you're talking about high-end titanium frame locks, you've got to talk about WE knives and Riot. I don't happen to have a Riot here with me, but certainly that's something to look at, especially, again, given the price of this and given what you can find something like this for on the secondary market. Lastly, of course, we've got a knife that I did a whole video about. So I actually did a full comparison video between these two, and both of them I would call, high-end titanium frame locks. They've certainly both got that ZT aesthetic, but this is going to be a little more carryable for most people and is probably one of the nicest ZT options out there. Not suggesting for a second that this one isn't pretty darn good. Okay, so in conclusion, the two things that I want to speak to here is, first of all, is this a good knife? Is this a knife that if you like the design and you can get one for a decent price, you should buy? And the answer to that, I think, is yes, right? If you look at this and you go, wow, that's such a cool knife, I just love it, then buy it, right? They've done a really good job here. It cuts better than most CTs. It feels great in hand. It has a really nice action. And so there's nothing here that would convince me to, that would make me want to push you away from this knife. Now, I would say, look at all the comparisons we just did. There are lots and lots of great options out there. So it's hard for this to stand out from the crowd, but it's certainly not a bad knife. Now, let me come back and comment on, and this is where we might get a little controversial. How does this stack up against something like the 0560, against something like the 0300, or even the 200? And by the way, all of those knives, I think, take a minute, Google them, take a look at side by side, and you can, I feel like all of those knives have had some influence on this knife, and I do think that it fits within the 0300 category, okay? I really do. Now, the question is it as good as those other knives? Or if you really, if you kind of like this, would you be better off to just go to the secondary market and find yourself a 0560 or a 0300? And guess what, guys? This is going to be a controversial opinion, but I think this is better than those previous options. Here's why. Okay, number one, the 0300 had an assist. This does not. And I definitely prefer non-assisted knives to assisted knives, especially in this category. Like, part of what's supposed to be good about a high-end knife is the action, okay? And by assisting a knife, look, if you want to assist a $50 knife, go nuts. I don't really care, because I'm not looking for fantastic action in a $50 or $65 knife or something like that. But in a $300 knife, one of the things I'm expecting is that you have done a great job machining this pivot, have gone to have put in a good effort to have great tolerances and to get the detent just right, so that that blade deploys really, really nicely without having any kind of spring or anything like that inside of it. And so in that case, this definitely does a great job. It is a nicer action than most of those other ZTs, especially the 0300 and the 0200. Now, compared to the 0560, again, it's not miles ahead. The 0560 had a pretty decent action, although there was some inconsistency with it, and some had such stiff detent they were almost undeployable. But the other thing is, the 0560 did not have a lock bar insert, and this one does. Now, again, the relief cut, that's probably something to consider, but unless you're going to be putting your knife through one of those cold steel torture tests, that relief cut is not the biggest thing to consider. And again, the 0300 failed there. The 0560 had a similar, kind of relief cut setup. And so I feel like, because of just the general advances and the higher expectations that now exist for, high-end titanium frame lock knives, this does do a better job in general than those knives. And the other thing is that I already mentioned, but I haven't said here in this portion of the video, it cuts better. Okay, there's no recurve here, which I was never a fan of on the 0300. The 0560 blade was quite thick behind the edge. This is thinner behind the edge. It's got a higher grind. And so once again, I would argue this probably cuts better than any other ZT that has ever been on the market. All right. Now, there's probably something out there that's similar, and I know that some of you want to prove me wrong, and that's fine. But at the very least, it cuts as well as any other ZT and better than most of them. All right. So that, I think, is significant. Now, lastly, the price point is a little high on this guy. If you really want one, I would probably be inclined to wait and pick one up on the secondary market, or give it some time. ZT does fairly frequently do some sales, especially if a model doesn't fly off the shelves immediately. The other thing is, if you're not in love with this color and this scheme, for popular models, ZT is known to do some crazy sprint runs. So I wouldn't be surprised if one of these comes along that's all blacked out, or that has tiger stripes, or various other options that some of you may be looking for. And so, yeah, you may want to wait to pick this up at a better price or in a different variation. But as far as I'm concerned, ZT has done a good job here, and I really do like this knife. Again, with the qualification that it's pretty expensive, and at its price point, there is a lot of competition. So as a consumer, I feel like that's a good thing. You can really have your pick of all kinds of fantastic knives at this price point. There you go, guys. So don't forget to check the channel sponsor down below. I'm going to link DLT in this, because they tend to have a lot of the knives that I've shown you here. Some of the other channel sponsors, their stock, especially right now with the COVID stuff, can be a little bit limited, and DLT can be limited as well. But using that link does help the channel. So thanks in advance for doing that. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear your comments down below. We will talk to you soon.